The purpose of today's brief lecture is to introduce the 4 views of youth ministry in the church found in Mark Center's book. First of the 4 views is the inclusive congregational model. The rationale behind the inclusive congregational model is that it pulls youth out of their ghetto. It is designed to help them not be limited to simply going to a youth group, but rather they are included in the overall congregation of the church. And this gives them both roots in the church, and it also frees them up to serve and participate more, and also to grow deeper. So we say that it gives them both roots and wings. And so youth ministry is included as part of the congregation's overall ministry. This model stresses integration with the overall church body, which, as we've seen from the sticky faith research, that integration with the church body as a whole is extremely important. Students who are connected with the congregation as a whole are less likely to drop out of church after they graduate from high school. So that is an extremely high value. As far as implementation of this model, the youth are incorporated into the existing ministries of the church, not as a separate ministry. And so youth are included in worship, in other forms of leadership. They have to be considered in all elements of church ministry. So we've got preaching, worship, and all different forms. And ministry to families should be of elevated importance because the idea is that students are not separated out. So if you've studied educational models and you've heard the nostalgia associated with the one-room schoolhouse, that's the idea. Is we're trying to make the church a one-room schoolhouse. We're trying to make the church a place where people of all ages are ministering together. And so there's been a lot of talk about intergenerational ministry recently, and the inclusive congregational view fits most comfortably with that sort of. Now let's take a look at the preparatory model. The preparatory model is one in which the youth ministry's function is to prepare adolescents to serve in existing churches as leaders, disciples, or evangelists. So it's the responsibility of, and it's owned by, the local church. Youth ministry must feature a balance of discipleship and evangelism. So let's take a look at this model. You can see there's some overlap with inclusive congregational in that it is about preparation. But the distinction is that in the preparatory model, there is not simply a combined youth in with the adult congregation for intergenerational ministry, but instead youth do have their own function, their own meeting, but that meeting is essentially about preparing them to serve within churches. So youth ministry in this model focuses both on discipleship and growth spiritually, but also on evangelism and looking outward. So the idea is that it's ministry focused rather than activity driven. It's focused more on the ministry that is accomplished through teaching the students and then preparing them to serve. So in this model, youth are both separated and integrated. So what that means is that, as in the inclusive congregational model, they're integrated into the overall life of the church. However, they still have their class. They still have a specific youth ministry program. Youth ministers have to be teachers in this model. Okay, they are essentially about preparing the students to serve. So in doing so, they themselves must know the material and they must be teaching that to the students at all time. Education in this model has a high value. And the training of volunteers is also emphasized in the preparatory model, because again, it's all about getting the youth ready to serve either as leaders or as congregation members or as evangelists in the existing church. youth are equipped to lead ministry and eventually take leadership roles. So that is the function of the preparatory model. Now let's take a look at the missional model. In the missional model, youth ministry must reach into the culture of adolescence, both secular and Christian. So we're aware that there is a sort of Christian subculture, especially in the West, and there is a Christian subculture even in American youth. So it's still the responsibility of the youth minister to understand and walk in that world. But what makes the missional model unique is that youth ministry has to reach into the culture of secular adolescence as well. So again, life is about being on mission, and the youth pastor is penetrating the world of the students. So the idea is reaching into that culture and then meaningfully assimilating the students into the church. Youth ministry must arise from the conviction rather than the need. So in other words, we are convicted about going into the world and making disciples. That's our mission. So we do youth ministry because we are following Christ and heeding his commandment, rather than the fact that there simply needs to be something for youth, or that the youth need some sort of activity to keep them busy in the life of the church. So therefore, youth ministry cannot begin and end with church youth in the missional model. In the missional model, the church youth are participants in the model and can even be co-leaders, but they are on mission, and they are about youth ministry within their culture. So in this model, churches have to acknowledge that culture has moved far away from the church. And this is something that I think churches are starting to do, but there are still some holdouts that would rather culture conform to the image of church in some glory day that has gone by. Here in this model, the church has to acknowledge that this is not where kids are. So incarnational ministry in this model is of the utmost importance. Youth workers must go into the adolescence world. We are called to go into the world and make disciples, and in the missional model, that's what it's about. Because of that, entire congregations have to be committed to seeing adolescents as worth it. They are worthy of love, focus, and care. And so, in doing so, then outside youth come to church and feel welcomed. They don't feel a bother. They don't feel like church is a place where teenagers should be seen and not heard. They are not coming into church having to learn traditions and rules and regulations, but instead they're coming into church and being loved and embraced. So, an example of this from my life is we used to have our high school meeting, and for whatever reason, it was directly after the Awanas meeting. So directly after the children's meeting, high school youth were starting to arrive at the church. And at one point, some kids were outside playing basketball, and these are not Christian kids. And sure enough, just as if it were scripted in a movie, as a couple of little kids are walking out and their parents are picking them up, one of the high schoolers says, "Throw me that expletive deleted basketball," right in front, and the mom's face just went white. And so this in turn led to a meeting with me and the senior pastor, and I just had to, I said, "Listen, I talked to the kid and let him know about respect, and he fully embraced that. But the truth is that we want these kids here. And so if you're going to pursue a missional view, then the church itself has to understand that it's going to get messy. And that's part of the way that this model works." Okay, finally, let's take a look at the strategic model as posited by Mark Center. So in the strategic model, youth culture is far more complex and ubiquitous today than ever before, and we need to acknowledge this, because for us to try to understand youth culture and then reformulate our programs to embrace that culture, what we're going to do is constantly be playing catch up. So this is what Center proposes. We take the youth ministry of our churches and we look at it in a different perspective. Instead of it being a separate function of the church, youth ministry should shape churches for future generations. So rather than trying to convince our youth to perpetuate current youth models and current church culture, instead we allow the youth themselves to shape future churches. And so within the strategic model, the church is seen as a community which needs an intergenerational continuity. So in other words, rather than just having an intergenerational implementation where young and old are working and serving side by side, but it's in the name of continuing church status quo, instead we want an intergenerational continuity where we start to see each generation creating its own church. And this is how that happens. Youth ministries themselves become church plants. So the youth minister takes over as the new pastor. And in the same way, the adult youth ministry leadership team will serve as the staff and the volunteers of the church. And the students themselves become the congregation. So in this model, specific attention is given to addressing the post-high school fragmentation, where students go off in their separate spiritual directions. So instead, one of the strengths of the strategic model is that it addresses this drop-off phenomenon where about 70% of kids drop out of church during their college years. And rather than having them fragment and go off into different areas, what happens is they themselves become the new church. So that's how the strategic model works. So let's wrap this up. Each model has its own strengths and weaknesses, and that'll be part of the content of discussion. It's imperative that we understand that no model is going to give us a sort of perfect solution to everything. Each model has worthy implementations. So our task is to use these as a springboard from which we create our own models, which are going to be uniquely situated to our ministry context. So there may be certain things that you can gather from each of these. So I look forward to seeing what each of you writes in the discussions as we tackle these, because this discussion is imperative as we look to move forward and implement youth ministry.